Also at 5, we're hearing from Nolan Wells, the 18-year-old who died over the weekend while on a boat trip with friends. As the mystery into his death is investigated, we're hearing from him himself.
It's really a blessing, just being here with some of my best friends, teammates, and we're all going to college together, most of us, so it's just truly a blessing to be here.
That was from February 2025, the day he signed to play football at Southwest Mississippi Community College in Pike County. He was last seen alive on July 4th on Horn Island, and his body was found 2 days later. Investigators are working to determine how he died. His friends told investigators they left the island and he stayed behind. They say he was supposed to take a different boat back to the mainland Saturday, but never did.
I would urge anyone that had information or was on the island to let us interview you and take down as much information as we can to really piece together and figure out what may have happened.
Nolan's family hired civil rights attorney Ben Crump. He says his team will conduct an independent investigation.
A month ago, Nolan Wells was 18 years old, thinking about training camp and talking to a girl he'd just met on a beach. Yesterday, in a Mississippi state office, a report was finished that may already hold the answer his mother has been waiting a month for. She still isn't allowed to read it. That's where this case actually stands right now, not at the beginning. You know he went to Horn Island on the 4th of July. You know he never came home. What you may not know is what's changed in the last few days and why people who've followed this case for a month are suddenly paying a lot closer attention. Start here. 3 weeks ago, the family's own medical examiner already gave his answer, and it wasn't a clean one. Cause and manner of death, undetermined. He reached that conclusion without everything he needed. Nolan's throat had been retained by the state's original pathologist, not unheard of, when investigators still have questions about the neck, but it meant the independent exam was already working with less than the full picture. Even so, what he did find was enough for the family's attorney to say something publicly that barely made a headline: an area of unexplained discoloration in the tissue at the back of Nolan Wells's head. Not an injury the report identifies, not an accusation, a question that, 3 weeks later, is still just a question. Then, yesterday, the second exam finished. Different lab, different pathologist, same 18-year-old, and unlike the family's version, this one isn't speaking at all. Not to reporters, not to the family, not to anyone, until a grand jury in Jackson County reads it first. 2 examinations of the same body. One already spoke and didn't have a clean answer. The other just went quiet and might. That's the update we're actually here for today. Not who Nolan Wells was. You know that part. What's newly confirmed? What's still just a claim? And why the answer his parents have been chasing for a month might already be sitting in a file neither of them is allowed to open yet. If you've been following this case, subscribe now, because we're about to get into an attorney sending cease and desist letters and openly promising a lawsuit is coming, a growing rift over whether Nolan's own stepfather actually knows the friend now speaking for him publicly, and a detail from a Marine Resources document that's already changing how people read that entire afternoon. Several threads in this case are about to collide, and today is the day to be caught up. Let's start with the part that actually changed this week, what a completed autopsy report means in Mississippi, and why finishing it hasn't answered anything yet.
The Jackson County Sheriff believes Nolan Wells died from an accidental drowning. The state medical examiner's office has now completed its autopsy, which lays out the official cause and manner of death.
The medical examiner would know that it was a drowning because the water would be in your lungs. If there's no water present, then it wasn't a drowning, it was something else.
Authorities now plan to send the autopsy findings to a grand jury, but a former Hinds County prosecutor familiar with the grand jury process believes investigators would want to submit additional information other than the autopsy so the grand jury could decide whether someone could face criminal charges in connection to Wells' death.
Maybe this is going to be a grand jury process that may take a day or a couple days, where they have people coming in to testify. All of the witnesses, who were there on that day may have seen, Nolan Wells, and they want to get their testimony, in front of the grand jury.
An independent autopsy commissioned by Wells' family found his death to be undetermined. The state crime lab didn't send Wells' throat and windpipe for the other pathologists to examine.
Of course, we heard, from Attorney Ben Crump about the throat being missing. They would look at things like that. I think if there was maybe trauma to the throat, that would say a little bit more.
The grand jury process is secret. Attorney Jasmine Davis says there's no limit for how long they could gather behind closed doors to consider any evidence. They could meet for months and in the end agree with the autopsy about how Nolan Wells died or come up with a completely different conclusion. Ross Adams, 16 WAPT News.
The Mississippi State Medical Examiner's Office announced that it has completed both Wells' autopsy and toxicology report, but those results are going to stay sealed until the grand jury gets the case. And while the medical findings are off limits, we know Wells' family is doing everything they can to get other information. Nolan's mother, for example, subpoenaed Meta, Snapchat, TikTok, Life360, seeking his messages, photos, GPS data as she pushes for answers as to what happened to her son.
A grand jury referral doesn't mean what most people assume it means, and that gap between assumption and actual procedure is where a lot of the noise around this case has come from. District Attorney Angel Myers McElrath addressed it directly in a video statement on July 23rd. Her office, she explained, sends nearly every death in the county through a grand jury, the only real exceptions being natural causes and non-criminal car accidents. That's not a decision being made about Nolan Wells specifically. It's the same process her office has run for years, on cases that never make the news. Here's what that process actually looks like. A grand jury in Jackson County is a panel of ordinary citizens, usually somewhere between 15 and 25 people. Prosecutors bring them evidence. There's no defense attorney in the room. There's no public transcript afterward. Their job is narrow. Decide whether probable cause exists to move forward. Not guilt, not innocence. Just whether there's enough to proceed. Which means, practically, that both autopsy reports, the sealed one from the state and the preliminary one the family already released, are heading toward a room nobody outside it will ever see into. Not reporters, not the public, not, at first, even Nolan's own parents. McElrath has framed the wait as necessary, saying, in her words, that the rules exist to search for the truth, not to stand in its way. Not everyone is convinced routine is a reassuring word here. Former Mississippi Judge Carlos Moore has pointed to McElrath's own record, including an earlier case involving a fatal police shooting, where he says her office had substantial evidence and still failed to secure an indictment. In his view, this referral shouldn't be mistaken for momentum until it actually produces something. He said he plans to watch this case closely. Attorney Tyler Bailey reads it differently. He agrees the referral itself is procedurally ordinary, but he also points out that even if the grand jury does eventually return charges, they wouldn't necessarily point toward homicide. Without a confirmed cause of death, he argues, the more realistic territory is what happened after Nolan disappeared. Obstruction, accessory after the fact, not the disappearance itself. Two lawyers, two very different expectations, and a process built specifically so that no one, on either side, gets to know which one is right until it's over. But before any of this, before sealed reports and grand juries and legal predictions, there was just a boat, a bilge pump that had already started failing, and a call for help that nobody on that radio yet understood the weight of. The morning looked like nothing more than a holiday. At 9:56 a.m., GPS data later confirmed, a boat pulled away from a private dock in the Ocean Springs area, carrying Nolan Wells and a group of friends, headed for Horn Island, a barrier island in the Mississippi Sound, about 10 miles offshore, reachable only by water. They arrived at 11:14 a.m. For the next several hours, the GPS simply shows the boat sitting still. Nothing dramatic, just a group of friends, among what would end up being hundreds of people on that beach that day, spending a holiday on a remote stretch of sand. That crowd matters because of what a preliminary Mississippi Department of Marine Resources document would later reveal. Witnesses told investigators Nolan had been drinking heavily that afternoon, alongside his friends. Toxicology results are still pending, so this is witness testimony, not a lab finding, but it's not disputed by the people who were there. Nolan's own friends have since said the same thing publicly. It's one more reason a beach full of hundreds of potential witnesses hasn't translated into a clear picture of that afternoon. Investigators have now interviewed roughly 60 of them. None, so far, has produced the one account that settles anything. At some point that afternoon, Nolan met a 19-year-old named Katie McCormack. What actually passed between them, her account of it, specifically, is something we'll come back to, because it matters more than almost anything else in this case. For now, here's what the timeline shows without her. Around 3 p.m., Nolan Wells was alive on Horn Island, seen by people who knew him. That's the last confirmed sighting anyone has established. At almost that exact hour, something else was unfolding a few hundred yards away. Something that had nothing to do with Nolan, and everything to do with what came next. The boat's bilge pump, the system that keeps water from collecting inside the hull, had failed. The boat was taking on water. Someone aboard called sea tow. That call matters more than almost any other piece of evidence in this case, for one reason. It was recorded in real time, hours before anyone on that boat had any idea Nolan wouldn't be coming home. Nobody could have staged it. Nobody could have shaped it around a story that didn't exist yet. Whatever else about that afternoon is disputed, a dispatch call from a boat in mechanical trouble is not one of those things. They never actually needed sea tow. Bart Edmiston Jr., a former Ocean Springs High School teammate of Nolan's, on the island that day with his own boat, arrived to help, and the group cancelled the call. It's a small detail. It matters later, because that single act of helping a stranded boat is a large part of why Edmiston's name ended up pulled into this case at all. Warren Hudson, one of the friends aboard, has said publicly that the group did ask Nolan to come with them before they left, and that he chose to stay behind with the girl he'd just met, intending to catch a ride back to the mainland later, a plan he's maintained the girl herself can confirm. That is Warren Hudson's account. It's presented here as exactly that, his stated version of a conversation only a handful of people actually heard. At 4:31 p.m., GPS data shows the boat left Horn Island. It didn't go straight home. Moving at barely 4 knots, it covered nearly 3 miles before reaching the original dock at 5:44 p.m., then moved through Fort Bayou, back to the dock, and out again, a slow, disjointed path that didn't fully resolve until after 7 that evening. Nolan was not on it, and for the next several hours, nobody called his mother. Online, that gap has been treated as suspicious ever since. At the time, it wasn't. By nearly every account, this wasn't a group making that trip for the first time. Boat runs to Horn Island, late nights, no check-in until morning. That had happened before, without incident. An 18-year-old not calling his mother on a holiday weekend wasn't yet a 5-alarm fire. It was just what being 18 looks like, most nights. Then, just after 11 p.m., Warren Hudson called her. Christine has said publicly that Nolan's friends didn't call her like that under normal circumstances. That call was the signal something was wrong. She opened a location-sharing app and searched for her son. What she found wasn't Nolan. It was his phone, sitting still inside a friend's house on the mainland. His keys were there too. Both had made it back from the island. Nolan hadn't. She called the Coast Guard herself. Hudson made a separate call around the same time. The response, from an agency built to handle exactly this kind of emergency, was that the situation as described didn't meet the threshold for immediate deployment. No boat went out that night. No aircraft went up. The call was logged, and the line went quiet. What followed was hours of Christine hitting walls, passed between agencies over a jurisdictional question with no clean answer. Horn Island sits inside the Mississippi Sound, and which department actually had authority over a missing person case that started out there wasn't something anyone could settle quickly, at midnight, over the phone. Eventually, the Jackson County Sheriff's Office agreed to open a formal report. Christine and her husband Elmore drove out that night to meet a deputy in a McDonald's parking lot and told him everything they knew. By then, Nolan had already been missing for hours. Elmore didn't wait for an official search to organize. The next morning, while multiple agencies were still coordinating on shore, he took out his own boat and went looking for his son himself. A father, alone on open water, searching before the machinery of an official response had finished assembling behind him. That official response did come together. By that evening, the Jackson County Sheriff's Department had established a command post at the Lake Mars boat launch in Ocean Springs, joined by the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources, the National Park Service's Gulf Islands National Seashore Division, the U.S. Coast Guard, the Harrison County Sheriff's Office, and the United Cajun Navy, a volunteer search and rescue group that, it turned out, had handled exactly this kind of search before. Incident Commander Josh Gill told local reporters the Cajun Navy was concentrating its search where Nolan had last been seen, near a girl on the island's north end. The organization's vice president, Brian Trasher, later described the water off that stretch of coast by the name locals use for it, the washing machine, a rip current strong enough, he said, to put even a capable swimmer in real trouble. He raised a question, too, that nobody has fully answered since. With hundreds of people spread across that beach on the 4th of July, not one of them has come forward to say they saw somebody in distress in the water. Sunday afternoon, Marine Resources launched drones to survey the island's western side. The heat that day was bad enough to swell the drone batteries. The flights were cut short. The search came back with nothing. Monday morning, July 6th, at roughly 8:45, a National Park Service ranger spotted a body in the water near Horn Island's northwestern shore. Sheriff Ledbetter said it matched the description that had been circulating for 2 days. The next day, Jackson County Coroner Bruce Lind confirmed the identification through dental records, with DNA testing to follow for full certainty. 2 days after he went missing, the search for Nolan Wells was over. What came next, figuring out how he ended up in that water in the first place, was only beginning. And the person who might have known more about his final hour on that island than anyone left standing on it had, so far, said almost nothing at all. For a month, the second most important person in this entire case has said almost nothing. Katie McCormack was 19 years old on July 4th, and by every account that exists, she was the last person outside Nolan's own friend group to speak with him before he vanished. She was there. She talked to him, and that single fact turned a private 19-year-old into one of the most discussed and most misrepresented figures in the entire investigation, almost entirely without her ever weighing in herself. For the first several weeks, everything attributed to Katie arrived second-hand. A family friend claimed to be relaying what she'd heard Katie say. Then Katie's own mother and sister began posting on Facebook, trying to correct rumors that had already spread past anything they could control. Each version passed through someone else's memory of a conversation before it ever reached the public. Katie herself never posted, never gave an interview, never confirmed or denied a single detail in her own words. As of this recording, that's still true. She has not spoken publicly about what happened on that beach, whatever you may have seen claiming otherwise. Then Christine Wansley did something none of the online speculation had. She sat down with Katie, face to face. Afterward, Christine said publicly that what Katie told her didn't fully line up with the version she'd been hearing secondhand from everyone else. She didn't spell out every detail of that conversation, but describing it as inconsistent, on the record, tells you something on its own. It's the clearest sign we have that the second-hand chain had already drifted from whatever Katie actually says happened. The most detailed account of Katie's actual position came not from Katie, but from her sister, Gracie, who spoke to the Daily Mail. According to Gracie, when Katie left the island, her understanding was that Nolan was walking back toward the boat he'd arrived on. She assumed his friends simply wouldn't leave without him. Katie didn't stay to watch him board. She left separately, with her own brother and his fiancée. a completely different group from Nolan's. That detail reframes the entire question. The popular version of this story has Nolan choosing to stay behind, specifically to keep talking to a girl he'd just met. Gracie's account says that isn't what happened, that Nolan believed he was heading back to his own boat, not making a decision to remain on the island. One version is about a teenager making a choice. The other is about a teenager who thought he'd already made his exit, and hadn't. None of this means Katie McCormack did anything wrong. She hasn't been accused of anything. Nolan's own family has said, on the record, that they don't blame her, and has voiced support for her directly. What she's actually facing is something else entirely. A 19-year-old who happened to be standing inside the last confirmed conversation of someone else's life, watching strangers build a narrative around her silence. So here's where the timeline actually sits. Around 3 o'clock, Nolan Wells was alive on Horn Island, seen by people who knew him. That's the last confirmed sighting anyone has established. The boat carrying his friends didn't leave until 4:31, 90 minutes. That gap, not whether Nolan wanted to leave, because by every account he did, is where this case actually lives. What happened between the moment he said goodbye to Katie and the moment that boat pulled away without him sits underneath every other question in this investigation. And it's not the only thing that went missing from that afternoon. Something else disappeared too. Not a person this time, but data. When Christine finally got access to it, what wasn't there turned out to matter almost as much as what was. When Nolan's phone made it back to the mainland without him, it sat inside a friend's house for hours before anyone thought to look at what was actually on it. When Christine finally did, both of Nolan's Snapchat accounts had already been cleared. No saved photos, no saved videos. And this from a kid who documented everything, the kind of 18-year-old who has a running record of every gathering on his phone, because that's simply what a holiday weekend with your friends looks like at that age. The content that should have been there wasn't. Some text messages appeared to be missing too. Under Snapchat's own retention rules, that kind of content is typically still recoverable for up to 24 hours after it's sent, a window that, when Christine looked, hadn't yet closed. None of that, on its own, proves anyone touched that phone with something to hide. People clear their phones constantly, for reasons that have nothing to do with a crime. What it does is raise a question only a forensic examiner can actually answer, not a comment section, not a hunch. And forensic extraction isn't the same thing as looking at an app. Data a user believes is permanently gone can often still be pulled by the right tools, well after the fact. Deleted isn't the same as destroyed. Sheriff Ledbetter's office has said it never physically had Nolan's phone and formally requested it for its own exam. By that point, the family's own investigators had already looked at the device first. Following a July 15th meeting between Christine, Elmore, and District Attorney Angel Myers-McElrath, both sides agreed to something legal analysts called highly unusual, a joint, simultaneous inspection where the family's forensic team and law enforcement would examine the phone at the same time, pulling data the same way, so neither side could later dispute what the other found or how they found it. An arrangement like that doesn't happen without real pressure behind it. It reflects how far trust had already eroded between this family and local investigators, and, to the DA's office's credit, a genuine attempt to close that gap rather than ignore it. As of the most recent reporting, the specifics are still being finalized between both sides, with the family's legal team now saying they expect the FBI to be present as well. It hasn't happened yet. When it does, it becomes one of the only pieces of evidence in this case that both sides will have watched pulled off the device, in real time, together. There's a simpler explanation for at least part of the phone story, and it comes from inside the friend group itself. Trayston Shepard, one of Nolan's friends, told ABC News that everyone in their group left their phones on the boat that day, specifically to keep them away from salt water and splashing. When he chose not to go in the water himself, he said, he set his own phone on the boat's dashboard, next to roughly 15 others belonging to the rest of the group. By his account, The reason Nolan wasn't with them when they left was simple. He'd met a girl and planned to catch a ride back to the mainland later, on a different boat. That explanation covers why so many phones ended up in one place. It doesn't explain what happened to what was on Nolan's, specifically, before his mother ever got the chance to look. And phones weren't the only piece of digital evidence in this case that ended up disputed. A short video clip did too, one that, weeks later, would end up pulling a completely uninvolved 21-year-old into a legal fight he never should have had to fight. Somewhere in the flood of footage taken on Horn Island that day, one short clip did more damage than almost any other piece of evidence in this case, and it wasn't even clear, for weeks, whose voice was actually on it. Early in the investigation, Ben Crump referenced a video circulating online in which a voice can be heard yelling, as if in the middle of a heated argument. Crump's team indicated, at the time, that they believed the voice belonged to Nolan. Within hours, that belief was being repeated online as settled fact. It wasn't. Tristan Shepard came forward to ABC News and said the voice was his, not Nolan's, from a separate, unrelated argument he'd gotten into that day, with Nolan somewhere nearby in the water, but never actually visible anywhere in the footage. When a reporter pressed Crump on it directly at a later press conference, his answer was noticeably more careful than his original statement had been. He acknowledged the claim had come from a single witness, that a second witness had since disputed it, and that his team now has audio experts trying to determine, definitively, whose voice is actually on the recording. He also committed, going forward, to presenting single witness claims as exactly that, a claim, not a fact. That video isn't only circulating online either. Investigators have specifically requested original, unedited photos and video from July 4th, particularly anything showing an altercation or showing Nolan himself. Whatever this clip actually captures, it's not just an internet theory anymore. It's something law enforcement wants to see for itself. A second, completely separate piece of audio caused a different kind of damage entirely, this time to someone who, by every account, wasn't even part of Nolan's friend group. Investigators obtained the Sea-Tow dispatch recording from that afternoon, the same call that independently confirms the bilge pump failure. Somewhere in its background chatter, online sleuths claim to make out a name, Bart. From that single, disputed detail, an entire theory got built, that Bart Edmiston Jr., a 21-year-old University of Wyoming punter and former Ocean Springs High School teammate of Nolan's, had something to do with what happened. Here's what's actually established about Edmiston. He was one of hundreds of people on Horn Island that day, on his own boat. When the friend's boat started taking on water, he's the one who showed up to help, the reason they cancelled the Sea-Tow call in the first place. His attorney, Russ Latino, says Edmiston never met Katie McCormack before Nolan's death and didn't know her at all, that he's voluntarily handed over his own boat, GPS records, and phone to investigators, and that he has never been named a suspect or person of interest by anyone actually running this investigation. A photo that circulated online claiming to show him with McCormack, Latino says, doesn't show her at all. None of that stopped it from spreading. On July 29th, Latino sent a formal cease and desist to a social media influencer, alleging she'd told her audience Edmiston was one of 3 suspects, that he'd caused or contributed to Nolan's death, and that he'd tried to cover it up, and, separately, that she'd published his home address and photos of his house. Latino says the fallout included a credible death threat against his client. He's given notice that he intends to pursue a defamation lawsuit, has hired a private investigator to identify others making similar claims, and has said explicitly that being young or unable to afford a judgment won't stop him from filing against them too. Nothing here says anything happened to Nolan that we don't already know. What it says, clearly, is how far a single mistaken word in a background recording can travel before anyone stops to check it, and what it can cost the person it lands on, even when every piece of paper he's turned over points the other way. 2 disputed recordings. 2 men whose names got attached to speculation faster than anyone could verify it. And still, weeks later, no confirmed answer to the one question actually driving all of it. What happened to Nolan Wells? 2 autopsies. 2 pathologists, working from the same 18-year-old, 6 days apart from each other, and worlds apart in how much either has told the public. The first happened on July 10th, 6 days after Nolan's body was recovered, and by then, according to the report itself, his body had already undergone marked decompositional changes. That single fact explains more of what follows than almost anything else in this case. Dr. Roger Mitchell, president of the National Medical Association and the former chief medical examiner of Washington, D.C., wasn't working from a body preserved the way the state's original examiner had it 4 days earlier. He was working from a body that had kept changing in the days since. Mitchell's preliminary findings, announced July 22nd alongside Christine and Elmore at the NARCIP's National Convention in Chicago, landed on cause and manner of death, undetermined, pending further investigation. Foul play, he said, couldn't be ruled out. It's worth being precise about what that phrase actually means. It isn't a finding of foul play. It's an acknowledgement that his exam, working with a body already compromised by decomposition, couldn't rule it out either way. 2 details from that report deserve slowing down on, because both have been misread online more than almost anything else in this case. The first is the red discoloration in tissue at the back of Nolan's head. The report doesn't call it an injury. It doesn't identify a cause. When additional dissections were performed specifically to look deeper, they found no fractures and no deep tissue injuries. That's not nothing, and it's also not the smoking gun it's sometimes been treated as online. It's an unexplained observation in a body that had already begun decomposing, which is exactly the kind of finding a second opinion is supposed to flag, without it necessarily meaning what people want it to mean. The second is the missing throat tissue. Part of it had already been retained by the state's original pathologist by the time Mitchell examined the body. That sounds, on its face, like evidence being withheld. Doctors who spoke to ABC News about the case said it's not uncommon for a medical examiner to keep tissue for closer study, and Mitchell's own report described the practice, in its own words, as common in forensic pathology. What it does mean, practically, is that the second opinion in this case was never working with the complete picture. Crump has since asked the state's office to share its own photos and observations from the original exam, so Mitchell's review can be as thorough as possible. As of the most recent update, that request hadn't been confirmed as fulfilled. Then there's the piece neither exam has answered: toxicology. Testing like this can take 6 to 8 weeks under normal circumstances, and decomposition itself can complicate the results, particularly for alcohol, which can actually form naturally as a body breaks down, meaning even the eventual numbers may carry their own asterisk. That matters, because toxicology is the one thing that could confirm or undercut the witness reports from earlier, that Nolan had been drinking heavily that afternoon. Right now, that's still testimony. Nothing chemical has settled it either way. Which brings this to yesterday. The state's autopsy, performed July 7th, 1 day after the body was found, on a body 4 days less decomposed than the one Mitchell examined, threats, is now complete. That's the word that turns the story from a mystery about one death. There's no initial indication of a crime, larger, and that investigators around the same time drowning, Christine and Elmore were choosing a church. They're still working writing to words to say about their son. But the actual started arriving for the family's on the freshest possible exam of Nolan's body says remains the harassment aimed at him. Nobody outside a small began the moment Mississippi's crossed into national news. Not the family, whatever Warren Hudson not received, the reporters who've covered every other piece of this case. He stayed home from Nolan's funeral, not even rather than risk showing up in person. 2 exams, and on July 30th, one already spoke. Judge Ashley Cole, from a body that had already started to change, said publicly didn't have a clean that her own family had been hit with a wave of freshest version of their own. This case would that last one is what finally produced a real arrest. At all. A man in California was taken into custody for allegedly threatening to kill Judge Something Cole. Much louder has been happening that everywhere else this case reaches, and included their images. And it's aimed at almost everyone. Investigators built the case the unglamorous way. Start with the cross-referencing an email because address, that single detail has been read 2 completely opposite ways online. a street address. Some people treated it as all of it pointed to one person. Quietly escalated into something far more serious. Represents. Others, a full month treated it as the federal government aimed stepping in to manage a narrative on that island rather than investigate the first person to face real legal consequences. Jackson Field office had nothing to do with what happened to both readings head-on. He was a public 2,000 miles away. Its role, threatening a judge's kids over a case he has been supporting the Jackson County Sheriff's Office from day one. AI-generated video of federal resources and has circulated online, while the sheriff's office built to look like the investigation, saying things she never actually said. The FBI's own Mississippi's Attorney General is narrower than people assume, has stated plainly interstate threats that anyone who threatens or intimidates investigators, Sheriff Ledbetter, prosecutors, separately confirmed, or witnesses in this case are also helping examine digital evidence, which he called state's public safety commissioner, given that Horn Island physically sits on federal land, saying online misinformation Gulf Islands is what's actually been driving these threats, where the two agencies already work together. State and federal law enforcement are both watching the situation in real time. Even Ben Crump, whose own past statements have occasionally poured fuel on exactly this kind of pile-on, has drawn a clear line publicly. Nobody in this story deserves to be threatened for being connected to it, and nobody deserves to be treated as guilty before the evidence actually says so. He's applied that standard to every name in this case, not only the ones his own clients are defending. Underneath all of it sits money. Combined reward offers for information leading to an arrest and conviction now total roughly $175,000. $125,000 pledged jointly by Al Sharpton, Tyler Perry, and Terrell Owens, alongside the family's legal team, plus another $50,000 added separately by Dr. Benjamin Hudson, Warren's own father. Dr. Hudson has been explicit that his family isn't pointing at anyone specific. His stated theory is simpler. People who know something are staying quiet because of how much pressure this case now carries, and he's hoping money might be what finally changes that. It's worth asking, honestly, why one teenager's death on a remote Mississippi island turned into $250,000 in reward money, national cable segments, and its own place in a much larger conversation. Part of the answer is Nolan himself, and a family that refused to let this quietly disappear. Part of it is bigger than this one case. Photos from that day show Nolan, who is black, surrounded mostly by white friends, and commentators including Stephen A. Smith have spoken publicly about a wider unease, especially within the black community, toward cases shaped like this one. It's also true that at least one other black friend was part of the group on the island that day. A detail that complicates any tidy version of that framing, and one that deserves to be said in the same breath as the rest. None of this tells you how Nolan Wells died. What it tells you is why, a month later, with 2 sealed autopsies and no official cause of death, this story hasn't faded. It's gotten bigger. And 3 weeks before any of this, before the autopsy results, before the reward money, before an arrest in California, this family had already stood in a church and buried their son. On July 20th, 16 days after he didn't come home, Nolan was laid to rest at Centerpoint Church in Ocean Springs. Christine had been clear beforehand about what she wanted the day to feel like. Not a room full of people sitting and crying, but a celebration of who her son actually was. A celebration of life, followed at the Jackson County Fairgrounds, open to coaches, teammates, and classmates from every stage of his football career, not just family. Reverend Al Sharpton officiated at the family's request. Tyler Perry covered the full cost of the service, and Christine made the deliberate choice to live stream the entire thing, opening one of the most private days a family endures to the national audience that had been following every other part of this story in real time. Before it ended, she turned to Nolan's friends, the same young people whose accounts of July 4th sit at the center of every unanswered question in this case, and asked them to take care of their own mental health. In the middle of fighting for answers about her own son, she made room to worry about theirs too. So here's where this actually stands, stripped of everything except what's real. Confirmed, the bilge pump failure, corroborated by a dispatch call recorded hours before anyone knew Nolan wouldn't come home. The GPS timeline, down to the minute, of that boat's entire day. A body identified through dental records on July 7th. 2 completed autopsies, 1 preliminary and public, calling the cause and manner of death undetermined and not ruling out foul play. 1 finished yesterday and still sealed. A joint phone inspection, agreed to by both the family and law enforcement, not yet carried out. A federal focus specifically on the threats surrounding this case, not the death itself. And, as of July 30th, exactly 1 arrest of a man who was never on that island over threats made to a judge's family. Still pending, toxicology on both autopsies. The state's findings, sealed until a grand jury reads them. That joint phone exam, confirmation of whose voice is actually on the disputed video. Whatever the family's own review turns up about where Nolan's body was found relative to where he was last seen. Still entirely unresolved, what happened in the 90 minutes between Nolan saying goodbye to Katie McCormack and that boat pulling away without him? That's the whole case, underneath every headline and every reward dollar. 90 minutes, on a crowded beach that not one of hundreds of witnesses has been able to fully account for. No cause of death has been confirmed. No one has been named a suspect. No charges have been filed. What's certain is smaller and matters more. A coach who remembered a kid who made every teammate feel like they belonged. A father who called his son a silent leader. A mother who says all her best parts are with him now. Nolan Xavier Wells was 18 years old, 2 days from training camp, and he did not come home. Whatever the sealed report finally says, that part of this story was never actually in question.